In 2016, right before the presidential election that shook the world, uh, my little brother was killed in a car accident. And ever since then, I've kind of had him in mind whenever I start a new project or set new goals or, things like that. Um, he's sort of my muse, I guess. And so to that end, I wanted to do something for his birthday, which was last week, on this show that would kind of honor him. So what I did was I contacted one of his bandmates from his high school garage band, who I have known since he was a really little kid, like I think probably kindergarten. And, just to kind of keep it all in the family, I wanted to get him to write a song. He's a guy named Dan, and Dan has gone on to become an accomplished, music producer and musician in his own right. And I asked him to write a new intro for my podcast. I think this intro, not only does it honor my little brother's memory, which I love, he would have been 33 a week ago, but also, it fits the Blackbird brand a little bit better, I think. And I really like it. So I hope you enjoy and appreciate this music as much as I do. So here it is, and happy birthday to my little brother, Jeff, and I will see you on the other side. Welcome to Blackbird episode number 8. My name is James, and today I am joined by Bryan O'Doherty. I first heard about Bryan on the School Sucks podcast hosted by Brett Venat. He recently, or I guess not so recently, like last summer, he did a series on integral theory with another libertarian podcaster by the name of Wes Bertrand. And in the middle of that series, they mentioned Bryan's essay on panarchy. But I wanted to get from Bryan sort of a synopsis of what integral theory actually is. And so I invited Bryan on to talk about not only panarchy, which is sort of his contribution to integral thought, but also just to get a good bare bones idea of what integral actually means. I think we'll probably learn more about this as I go forward. It's definitely something that I'm interested in, so I've reached out to another integral thinker who is a bit more of a generalist than Bryan, and hopefully you and I can learn a little bit more about what is to come. What got me interested in integral in the beginning was I asked in Thad Russell's group what he thought would be sort of the successor to postmodernism, because as we all know, like the general philosophy or like the cultural worldview never stays the same. Like modernism turned into postmodernism. And so postmodernism can't be just the final thing. Like we haven't gotten it right yet. And so that's where someone mentioned integral to me. And that's when I had realized that I had heard about integral on the School Sucks podcast and just written off that entire series that Brett did because it was so complicated and not really up my alley. As it turns out, it was definitely up my alley. And I think that you will probably be interested in it as well. So here is my interview with Bryan O'Doherty. And also, I want to mention, this is a very complex topic. So there's a lot of jargon and there's like color codes and stuff. So in the show notes, I put like the image that I was using to kind of keep up with the color codes that Bryan was using. And Bryan differs just a little bit with traditional integral theory because he uses a different color code that was from Spiral Dynamics, which was sort of the predecessor to integral. You'll get the hang of it as we go along, but I did want to let you know that if you click the link or just go to blackbird.substack.com, you'll see the image there that I was using so that you can kind of follow along with these colors. And I think that'll help you to kind of get a firmer grasp of what we're talking about. Although I think that I did do a pretty good job of digging into this so that the layperson can get an understanding of it a little bit better. And so with that, here is my interview with Bryan O'Doherty. All right, Bryan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So I was listening to or like a series of the School Sucks Project podcast, and they did a whole series on integral theory and devoted at least one and maybe two episodes to an essay that you wrote a few years ago on integral politics. So I wanted to have
Integral
you
mode.
on
Yeah.
to talk about what integral theory is, and then maybe get into a little bit on your thoughts of what an integral politics would look like, namely panarchy. So before we do that, though, why don't I just let you kind of introduce yourself to the audience as, sort of a fellow traveler in the libertarian sphere who probably not many people have actually heard of.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised no one's heard of me. I'm just basically a guy, a layman, so to speak. I don't have like any formal education in political science or anything like that. I just do a lot of reading. And in 2012, of course, I'm libertarian bent. I'm actually I guess I would consider myself like, I don't know, a closest thing would be like an agorist or something like that, voluntarist. And I just doing a lot of reading, very interested in economics, very interested in politics, and very interested in philosophy in general. Stumbled onto Ken Wilber when I was just after college, and I was just floored by him. I mean, it was like an eye just opened, and really got into Ken Wilber. And so, yeah, that's kind of how I started writing about, or how I started thinking about, okay, because Wilbur, of course, if you've heard the School Sucks podcast series, he's kind of like the father of the integral philosophy. And so, yeah, I just started thinking, okay, so what would the politics of an integral society look like? Because Ken never really put that into concrete terms. And the integral movement as a whole, at least up until the time I wrote those essays, was far more concerned with things like, spirituality, consciousness, personal development, things of that nature. So there hadn't really been a whole lot of involvement or talk about politics up to that point. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of how I got started with it. Just started thinking about it and came up with panarchy. And one important thing I like to point out is that even though I've been kind of pushing this sort of idea of panarchy, I myself am a voluntarist. So, I just see panarchy as a way to, allow people with different types of how people who want to organize their societies in different ways in a voluntarist structure, how to make that happen and how to let people do that. So that's kind of how it came about.
Yeah. So from a political standpoint, it does seem like a lot of people in the integral movement, just from what I've listened to and read. I haven't read a lot of Wilbur, but I've listened to interviews with him, and I checked out Ubiquity University, which is sort of an integral school that I think Ken Wilber sits on their board of regents or something like that. It does seem like it comes from sort of a lefty globalist point of view, or from that direction anyway. Like the Ubiquity U talks a lot about the United Nations agendas in a positive way. Bill Clinton has endorsed Ken Wilber's philosophy. So how popular is your idea of panarchy in integral circles?
In integral circles, it has a following, but it's not, I wouldn't say it's mainstream, although it has become more and more mainstream. The concept of panarchy has become more and more mainstream over the years. So, at first, not at all, but recently, it's become more and more of a word people are willing to use, and an idea that people are willing to integrate, I guess. But I think what a lot of that is folks that come to Integral, especially in the 90s and early aughts, in that early time when Wilbur was writing a lot and sort of the ideas were first forming. The types of people that were attracted to that weren't necessarily very interested in politics. I mean, they weren't that just wasn't why they were there. So I think, I think a lot of it is just, people kind of adopting whatever political stances they brought with them from, say, Green, right, where they were formerly at before they made the developmental consciousness leap into Integral. They sort of just brought that with them. And, Integral theory, of course, has the idea of lines of development, right? So it's not necessarily, even if you cognitively you are, at the integral stage, or you've gone beyond postmodernism and now you're in this integral stage of development cognitively. In other lines, you may not be there yet. So, you may still be on the political line or on the moralistic line or on the whatever. You might still be at a lower stage and still kind of working your way there. So I think that has something to do with it. A lot of people in the integral spheres I would describe as just apolitical. Like they're just not, it's just not something that really drives their interest. And then I think there are integralists who are, diehard anti-capitalist socialists, whatever. So I think they're really, it's like any other thing. They're just all stripes, all types of biases, all types of people, and that's fine. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with that necessarily.
So it's kind of like agorism in that sense. I mean, you've got agorists who come at it from sort of a right-wing bent, and some who come at it from like the conspiracy bent, and even not even, but like this might actually be a large, maybe not more majority, but plurality, who come at agorism from like the green bent. I mean, gosh, what's the name of that garden design thing that Jack Spirko talks about? Well, anyway, I can't remember, but I mean, there's a lot of talk about kind of being one with the earth and that sort of thing. And there's agorist thought leaders who are very into that spirituality and
for sure. And I'm the same way. I mean, I kind of told you before we started recording this, but I went back to the land for like 3 years. I was recycling my own human waste and fertilizing my fields with it. So,
goodness,
that
is a whole other level, man.
Yeah. I mean, I've really been, all of that is sort of part of who I am. So, people, especially because I tend to focus on panarchy so hard in my, when I'm on, like integral Facebook groups or I'm publishing my blog or whatever, that part of me kind of I don't really talk about it that much, but I've always kind of considered myself like, I don't know, conservative hippie or something, so yeah, I mean, yeah, stewardship of the earth, spirituality, all of that stuff is also important and to me as well.
That's why I've kind of before I and I think we should probably get into what integral theory is in just a minute. But before I sort of discovered integral theory, I had always made the argument that the kind of future of politics is going to be an alliance between like the Bernie Sanders Dem Sox and the Ron Paul libertarian types, because you see a lot of that synthesis where the sort of free market types and the sort of socialist types are focusing on the same issues, just coming at it with kind of different problem or solutions rather. Right. So I guess that's a kind of good segue. I asked the question, what comes after postmodernism? What does postmodernism look like? Because I've always kind of been taken, or maybe not always, but for the last several years anyway, been taken with the notion that truth, and particularly moral truth, is something that we kind of arrive at together rather than something that's determined and set in stone. And I really like that framework, but I've seen it slipping. And to me, postmodernism and integral theory and modernism and all of these isms are more descriptive than prescriptive. I don't think that Foucault was setting out a plan for what his ideal society looked like. I think he was more just saying, "Hey, this is what society looks like." So I guess, so yeah. What do you think of that? And also, how does integral theory sort of look like the next step in societal evolution?
Sure. Well, the postmodernism and sort of I guess if we're going to use integral terms, the green wave of consciousness is brings a lot of really great things to the world, right? One of the primary things that it brings is the realization that there are relative truths, or that every sort of viewpoint, or meaning, if you will, because we're talking about levels. From an integral standpoint, we're talking about levels of development, but from a green standpoint, they don't see it that way yet. So postmodernists don't see it that way yet.
Yeah, that's one thing. Nobody really sees that they're just another step in the evolution.
That doesn't happen until you get to integral. So I guess that's the biggest distinction, is that, like, at postmodern, you're still, you can see the relativism. You can see the sort of the pluralism that's there, that there are all these different ways of seeing the world, and those different ways of seeing the world are true from the standpoint of where they are, right? So, but the mistake that postmodernism makes is they say, and my way of seeing that is the only way to see it, right?
Right.
So
yeah.
it's kind of a they're still sort of reductionists in that way. And once you get to integral, we sometimes it's called like the map maker stage, or you're trying to map the territory, right? Integralists love sort of charts and graphs and maps. So
just doing some preliminary reading up on it, I have noticed that for sure. And you're talking about green, and that's one thing. There's a whole color code that I'm going to have to put in the show notes so that people kind of understand what we're talking about.
And it's confusing because the color code changes.
Right. Yeah. There's at least two different schools of thought that I've seen, that where, sometimes it's green and sometimes turquoise is a different color. I don't really remember all of it, but So, do you know, just off the top of your head, do you know how Wilbur came up with the colors?
Yeah. So, the color scheme was originally created by Don Beck, and he was a student of Clare Graves, who came up with sort of the original spiral dynamics letter codes, because before there were colors, there were letters. So,
spiral dynamics was the other thing I was trying to remember just now that I couldn't remember. So.
Yeah. So, and so Beck and Wilbur got together, and they created spiral dynamics integral. And so the original color scheme from bottom to top, beige, purple, red, blue, orange, green, yellow is integral, and then turquoise. And above that, there are some others, but that was the sort of the original. And that was what we worked with for many years. And then Beck and Wilbur kind of parted ways a little bit. I think they still talk. I don't know, but they parted ways, and Wilbur came up with his own color scheme, to kind of differentiate himself, or maybe he just thought it made more sense to him, or I'm not exactly sure. But he replaced some of the colors and he made it more of a chromatic progression. So I think his started out at infrared, replaced beige, then there was magenta replaced purple, then you had red, then amber replaced blue. He kept orange, he kept green, teal replaced yellow, and then he kept turquoise. So it was kind of this progression from warm colors to cool colors.
Okay.
But interestingly, what I think is lost with that, and why I prefer to stick with the original Spiral Dynamics colors, is because Beck's original conception of those colors had meaning, and he oscillated from warm to cool to warm to cool to warm to cool, and he did that because each stage of development had a tendency to favor sort of individualism or communalism. So
that is, yeah. Okay. So the oscillation is definitely something that I've been doing a lot of thinking about lately. In addition, the cyclical nature of all of this stuff. I sort of discovered this integral theory in the midst of trying to wrap my head around societal evolution from the standpoint of Eastern philosophy, which, as you know, as everybody knows, is more cyclical than linear. And I think that this thing that I'm reading about now is a really good way to put that oscillation of, like you said, individualism and collectivism over the wheel of, you know, from like peasant to warrior to priest to priestly class to merchant class back to peasants, and then also keep it in a linear fashion, because, like, you know, from our framework in the West, a timeline is what makes sense. Sorry. Okay. So I interrupted you. Why don't we get back to what is integral theory?
Okay. So integral theory is just the, well, I guess the best way to put it is it combines a lot of different developmental theories together into a kind of coherent framework. So what Wilber did was he did a lot of research and brought a lot of different schools of thought together, including spiritualism, Eastern religion, but also including developmental studies, whether you're talking about consciousness development, moral development, ego development, you know, how different religions and how they work in developmental levels. You know, people like Fowler and Gebser and Kohlberg and Lovinger, and so on. So he kind of took all these developmental ideas and then he incorporated a lot of religious traditions as well, and he created this model. We call it the AQAL model. It's AQAL, all quadrants, all levels. You can easily find that on Google if you just type in AQAL, do an image search, boom, you'll get a million different versions of this. But it's basically a 4-quadrant model. And you have in the upper left-hand corner, you have the I quadrant, which concerns the interior self. So your subjective me space, right? How you feel on the inside, right? And then you have on the upper right, you have the sort of exterior I, or, you know, your biological body or the physical space around you, right? Just, and that's sort of, you know, your brain, your behavior, all the objective facts about you, right? So, and that's true for all the quadrants on the left versus the right. So on the left side, it's all about sort of subjective interiors. On the right side, it's all about objective exteriors. And on the bottom left, you have the we space, which is the cultural sort of worldview space. Again, interior collective, okay? And then on the lower right-hand side, you have the it space, which is our social systems, sort of our objective exterior collective space. That would include politics, that would include economics, and all the stuff that I talk about with panarchy is pretty solidly in that lower left quadrant. And so that's the map. And then in those quadrants you have your different levels. And of course we color code those levels just for ease of understanding. When we're talking to each other, we kind of know what we're talking about. If we say red, we know what level that is and what the characteristics of it are. But I guess that's one of the biggest problems with Integral is all the jargon, and that's a criticism even within the Integral community. A lot of people in the Integral community have trouble with the jargon as well. It makes it extremely inaccessible from the outside. It's like, if you don't know it, you have no idea what we're talking about. And so that is a challenge in talking about these things, obviously. But
yeah, it does. It almost, some of the language that I've seen from Integral theorists, I guess, is, it does ring almost like, Masonic initiation.
Yeah.
You start out with a very basic conversation like this, and you learn the higher truths or whatever, or at least the higher doctrines, maybe, right. As you kind of go along. And, that's in any sort of complicated or complex system, that's sort of the way it needs to go. I mean, look at libertarianism just as a framework that everyone listening probably can identify with. 10 years ago, libertarianism was synonymous with constitutionalism. I mean, people were asking, what's the difference between the Libertarian Party, because also libertarianism was synonymous with the party that bore its name, and the Constitution Party, in America anyway. It has taken, since, the Ron Paul revolution or whatever, so we're in 2021 now, so that's 13 years to really understand that libertarianism isn't all about politics, and it's certainly not all about a party. But it was a good place to start, the Bill of Rights. Okay, great. So talk a little bit about like the progression of societies. I think this is the coolest thing about integral theory. Like, it starts out with just the savage man, basically.
Yeah, sort of. So you start out in beige with, survival, sort of this survival instinct. And it's all really just about, the basic needs of food, shelter, procreation, that's sort of what that whole developmental level is concerned with. And so you can kind of imagine like primitive man, maybe even before we discovered fire, just 250,000 years ago, roaming the savannas of Africa. And that's beige. Okay. Very animalistic, totally at the mercy of nature, entirely at the mercy of nature. So that's where we start. And there aren't really any good examples of that in modern life, except maybe the mentally ill or like homeless people with mental impairments like that are just, they're just, all they're doing is surviving, and they're completely at the whim of their environment. Okay. Those are kind of the characteristics of that level.
So even like the tribal societies that, if your boat should happen to float up on their island, they murder you. Would that even be like a step above this?
That would be more advanced. Yeah.
Yeah.
That
Okay.
would be even more advanced.
Because it goes from individual to collective. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So, okay, great.
And so yes, this is an individualistic stage, beiges. It's one of the warm stages, we'd say, but then you go to purple or magenta, if you like Wilbur's color scale. And that's your sort of your tribal stage. And that is a communal stage. And it's also called the magic stage. And the primary difference there is the idea that you can control your environment through the use of magic. Now, magic meaning things like creating fire, or somehow manipulating your environment in order to produce results, right? So,
essentially, any technology sufficiently complex.
Right. And it could be as simple as, praying to your tribal gods or making offerings to your tribal gods in order to ensure, a good harvest or a successful hunt or rain or, whatever it is that your tribe needs. Okay. But, at this stage, the conception of the individual is lost in the tribe. So you very much think of yourself as your tribe. There's very little differentiation between you and your tribe. Right?
I want to stick to magic for just a second, because it's something that I'm having trouble wrapping my head around, and we're hearing a lot about it lately. So there's two different things that you just gave as examples for magic. One is fire being a technology. And then there's that old quote. It's something like any technology sufficiently misunderstood is indistinguishable from magic, or something like that. Then there's also the sort of superstitious aspect of magic, where you think that because I did X, like real world impact happened.
Yeah.
So how are, I guess, those two things related? And I'm asking you to brainstorm with me, unless there's actually an answer to it.
Well, I mean, they're related in the sense that at this stage of development, basically, so the magic is outside of yourself, right? So you're calling on the magic from the environment. And you may have to do some ritual in order for that to happen. But you're basically taking it's the first stage where you're able to take the environment and manipulate it for your own ends. And that's the magic. That's the manipulation of those energies, I guess, is the magic. So whether the purpose is to create fire, and you have some ritual involving, taking an ember and what you do with that ember, and, praying and blowing your life force into it, or whatever that sort of ritual is, and that creates an effect. And then, but they wouldn't see that as I'm the one creating the fire, right? You would see that as sort of a magical force that you're manipulating. So while we would see that as a technology from that magical standpoint, there is no difference between creating that fire and dancing for rain. I mean, those two things are the same, if that makes sense.
Sure. So, and do you think that right now there's kind of a lot of that going on? I'm thinking a lot about, the storming of the Capitol was an assault on the temple of democracy. And, if we're gonna beat COVID, we have to go through these just wear the damn mask, just stay home, flatten the curve, all of these almost spells or whatever. But
one thing to remember that Integral teaches us is that we all have these levels within us.
Yeah.
And okay, so we can draw on them at any time. And what tends to happen is the more dire one's circumstances and the more threatened one feels,
right,
the lower and lower you regress to pull out, solutions. So you can imagine that, regular, loyal, patriotic, church-going Americans, amber, blue level, right, if pushed really hard, will regress into red,
right,
and tribalism, even into magic.
Well, and we all will. That's the thing. I mean,
it's pushed hard enough, sure.
Yeah, and so a lot of the charts that you see, in addition to the colors, they also have sort of ages at which these things develop in the individual. So like the
childhood development and so on. Mm-hmm.
yeah. So this magic stage is from like the age of 1 till about the age of 3.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So, and basically what that is where the child is kind of learning, look, if I, make this muscle tense, my finger moves or whatever.
Well, no, it's more like, it's more this, and I'm not an expert on child development.
No.
So
Yeah, that's fine.
I don't really know it all, but, you could think of it as like, how does a 2-year-old react when you leave the room and appear again? Like if you play peekaboo.
Okay.
You play peekaboo with a child, right? Well, from the child's perspective, when you hide, you're gone. Like you literally disappear from the world.
Okay.
You are out. Okay. And then when you reappear, magically, you're there again. So, I mean, you can think of it in that sense, like peekaboo to a child, the game has way bigger consequences than it does for us. It's like, and they respond accordingly. Like they're just like, wow, So, I mean, that's kind of one way to think about it, I guess. But yeah.
All right, awesome. So what's next after magic?
So then we have the egoistic stage. So the fundamental thing about the egoistic stage is that this is the stage where you realize that you have the power within you. So it's no longer about drawing magic from the outside world and manipulating the outside world. You are now the source of power, or your gods, or whatever, right? You are, so this is sort of I like to call it the Conan the Barbarian stage. It's or the Viking stage, right? It's very all of these powers that were formerly assigned to nature or the great volcano or whatever the force was that it's assigned to is now personalized. So it's now the god of thunder, Thor. He's a man, he's a guy that you could actually talk to. Like you can stand there and look at him,
And this is back to an individualist in the oscillation.
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. So it's very egocentric. It's very narcissistic. And I'm not saying these things in a negative light. I mean, like at a stage appropriate level, these are important things, right? It's the stage at which people build their self-confidence. It's the stage at which people develop their sense of personal power. So it's a very important stage. But its pathologies are also pretty brutal.
Yeah. It's and the ages on the chart is ages 3 to 6, which is
right.
That's when, according to personality psychology anyway, that's when a child's personality is basically set. Around the age of 4 is, how you act at the age of 4 is probably how you're going to act. And this is more from a personality standpoint than a behavior standpoint. But it is a very important stage, I think, in personal development and probably in societal development as well.
Like in childhood development, where you'll see things like bullying start to happen.
And being the victim of bullying as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So yeah, that's very important. And it's from a social standpoint, we're talking about chiefdoms. We're talking about the rise of empires, things like the Roman Empire or the Babylonian Empire or that type of thing. Sort of the God King is a very red concept. Egocentric concept. So yeah, that's kind of that stage, I would say.
All right, great. So then after that, can you tell me what you call it again? The ego stage?
Egocentric for
Egocentric.
red.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
And then, so after that is amber, I believe, right?
After that is amber or blue if you're talking spiral dynamics, and blue, a cool color. That's a communal stage. That has a lot of different names. Some people call it traditionalist, authoritarian. You could call it. It's the mythic membership is another word that's used sometimes, or term that's used sometimes. It's basically, so now power is no longer, it's no longer I have the power, but we have the power. And the we in this case is your not tribe, but let's say like culture or nation or could be a kingdom or whatever, right? And that power comes from a source, and that source traditionally has been a god. So, and like in a monotheistic sense of a god, or in the modern sense, like in modern times when we've seen this crop up, the source of power could be an authority figure, Stalin, Mao Zedong, or something like that, or a concept like the fatherland, the motherland, that kind of thing. So it's very nationalistic, it's very ethnocentric, it's very, my side can do no wrong. So kind of that type of thing. So it's patriotic. It's very patriotic. So yeah, I would say like the bulk of humanity really right now is at this stage.
Okay.
Actively, yeah.
And this is also, well, sure. And you just have to listen to, a Jeff Dice speech to know that. I mean, it's all about hearth and home, and, and there's good and bad from this. I mean, from the same
all these stages are beautiful. I mean, they all have good and bad.
Absolutely. So from this, you get things like fundamentalist religions and even fascism.
Yeah, you can.
But you also get like a good sense of purpose and a sense of right and wrong and that sort of thing. So
yeah.
I think this is a very formative stage. It's
and so this is this stage is also important because it marks the shift from what's sometimes called pre-conventional to conventional.
Describe that.
So this is sort of an ego development kind of framework, but conventional being, shoot, you're gonna make me describe this, huh?
No, it's fine. So is it like
more prepared?
Is it like we have gone from we do this because it pleases the gods to we do this because we do this?
No, it's more it's more like law oriented, or so rather than obedience oriented or like self-interest driven type of sort of drives, I guess, internal drives, where I follow orders because the guy above me tells me to, or the more powerful guy tells me to do it, so I do it. It's more like I do it because the rules say I have to do it.
Right. Okay. So it's about conventions, like
and like social conventions, traditions, that type of thing. Right.
And again, that's like you said, this is where a lot of people are.
Law and order is big for conventional,
for sure,
thinkers, and then you go on like in the higher stages, you're post-conventional, which is gives you a little more freedom, I guess, of thinking.
Yeah. So this seems like where in America conservatives are a lot of the time.
Yes.
Yeah, and then after this is I guess it's orange in both.
Orange. Yeah. Orange in both. Yes. So orange is typically called modernism, or
and it's where a lot of libertarians are.
Yeah. Well, particularly, I would say like
Well, and classical liberals, broadly speaking.
classical liberals is probably a better way to put it, because libertarians have a little bit of something extra that you don't see in orange. But orange is the first stage where you start to have universal values. So in other words, values that don't just apply to me and my people, but values that apply to everyone, right? So sort of the universal rights of man, that type of idea comes at orange. And orange is again a more individualistic stage. So people at orange are it's sometimes called the strive drive stage, or the stage at which rather than working for my God, or or being working out of a sense of loyalty to something, I'm working toward a sense of achievement for myself. Or I want to achieve something within my society. That's sort of the drive at orange.
And this is sort of also where we see the beginning of like the scientific method and
yes, rationality,
industrialization too.
Industrialization, is that absolutely? Yeah.
Okay.
Orange is often considered the wealth generation stage, the stage at which societies go from being sort of medieval to modern. And so it's an important stage because it creates all of the wealth that green is going to later spend. So it's pretty important. I mean,
all right. Well, with that, let's get into green then.
Yeah. So green comes about, and I should say that sort of all of these stages of development, they emerge as a result of the excesses of the stage before.
Yes.
Okay. So
do they emerge following catastrophe most of the time?
They don't.
Or is that not necessarily the case?
I think historically, probably that the catastrophe results is the result of the excesses of, see, I have this, it's like this idea of a wave, right? And you have, the wave function peaks at an apex, sort of the highlight, the golden age, and then it starts to drop and devolve, I guess, or metastasize, whatever you want to say.
Yeah.
So all of these stages kind of go through this life cycle. And so, orange comes about as a result of the excesses of the blue, monarchies of the world, and sort of
feudalism and all that,
and the aristocracy and hereditary versus merit type of achievement and all that kind of stuff. All of those things start causing life conditions, as they say in thermodynamics, to shift, and then a new wave emerges to solve those issues. So the same thing happens with orange. Orange is a very materialistic stage of development. And whether you're talking about it in terms of, libertarian or liberal materialism, or in terms of socialist or communist materialism, it's very reductionist. It reduces everything to material wealth, who has it, who doesn't, how it's generated, and so the problems that come about because of that need to be solved, and green comes in to solve those problems. And what green says is, green is concerned with, whereas orange is concerned with equality, green is concerned with equity. Green was concerned with fairness. It's concerned with it's also concerned with sort of a more holistic, more global impact. So things like environment and the harm of industrialization on the environment. So all of these excesses of orange, green comes in to try and heal those, whether it's income inequality or, and so, for when I talk about green, because I come at it from a very libertarian standpoint, I actually consider libertarians to be a green stage.
Okay.
More so than an orange stage. Orange stage, I'm talking more about classical liberalism as orange. Libertarians, because they have this, you can think of libertarians as sort of, the pot smoking conservatives.
Yeah.
Well, but the reason we think of them that way is because they are integrating all of the green sort of concerns, but coming at it from a completely different direction.
Yeah. Okay.
Than the typical green, like social change, because green, of course, is again a very communal stage. So what's important to remember, though, is that you can go through these stages. You don't necessarily have to follow the bent of the stage. So you can go through a communal stage in a very agentic way or a very individualistic way.
Yeah, agentic is a word that I had never heard until I started reading you.
Yeah.
So that's basically just individual agency. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yep. So yeah, so again, green is very concerned with tempering orange, creating sort of, it's very the greatest good for the greatest number.
So what about the libertarian? I mean, some people think that libertarianism is synonymous with individualism. How do you square that with this being a cool color sort of collectivist stage?
Well, yes, libertarians are very individualistic, but at the same time, at least my experience in libertarian spheres is that they are very concerned with, like, for example, the greatest good for the greatest number.
Mm-hmm.
But how they approach that is very different. So they would approach that from an individual standpoint. They would say the greatest good for the greatest number is achieved by granting people the freedom to pursue their own goals and pursue their own happiness.
Yeah.
And then and basically not rewarding not playing favorites. So in other words, so the libertarian critique of orange, of course, is sort of the same critique same critique of the socialist critique of orange, which is that orange tends to capture the regulatory sphere and create favorites. Mm. So, the banks or the oil industry or whatever, right? Libertarians are against that every bit as much as socialists.
Yeah.
Sort of the corporate takeover of the levers of power, right? So I think the goals are the same. Libertarians on the one hand and socialists on the other. It's one of the things I realize as I kind of get more and more in integral spaces. Mm-hmm. And thinking about these things is that the goals are the same, but there's something in our brains that's just different. And so the way we conceptualize and the way we think about these things is just completely different.
Yeah.
And that causes us to not only think that the solutions should be different, but to think that the other guy's solutions are actually evil.
Yeah, I'm a gay man living in Minneapolis, and so I think that Minneapolis being one of the most progressive cities in the, I mean, it's like Portland Junior.
Right.
I think that might be why I identified that, look, we're looking at the same problems here, and maybe we have different solutions, but at least we're heading in the same direction.
Right.
And it's definitely something that will help us get into an integral stage. But before we move on to the next tier, well, let's talk, first of all, let's talk about tiers. Because this green stage is the end or the top of the first tier of the progression, I guess.
Yeah, so you have the first tier and the second tier. And the first tier, those sort of 6 stages in that first tier, are the self-referential stages, or they're basically stages. The biggest difference is that when you're in those first tier stages, you're unable to see outside of your current worldview lens. So if you're at green, you see the world through that green lens, period. You're not able to take off those green glasses and put on some blue glasses, or take off those blue glasses and put on some orange glasses. You're not able to do that.
Which is where like cancel culture and the sort of authoritarian relativism comes in.
And it's why green, for example, so green is as sort of the leading edge of our current society. It's where all of our,
academics and
social cues come from, political correctness and all of that. All of that at this time stems from green. Green has an impossible time figuring out their interlocutors. So like what you often see is you see a lot of people at lower stages that adopt the outward appearance of a higher stage in order to gain social standing.
Oh, okay.
So the lower stages, particularly, all of them do it. Red, amber, or red, blue, orange will all do this. Okay. And the way they do it is slightly different. So what orange does is it virtue signals to green. And so this would be like a corporation that puts solar panels on top of its roof.
Right.
Oh, look at us. We're green, or an oil company that invests in electric vehicles, Yeah, right. So, these are all sort of just signals. They're just trying to, it's like and sometimes this goes horribly wrong, like Gillette razors, and their commercials
and their dude bro ad.
Right.
Yeah.
So sometimes this goes really wrong for them, but that's what it is. That's what orange tries to do, is it tries to, gain success by signaling at the level that's driving our social sphere, right? What blue does is blue takes on green as a religion. So this is where the woke religion comes from, or what some people call the blue church, or whatever. That's where blue is taking on the sort of ideas of green and taking them on as articles of faith, and then persecuting the non-believers.
Okay.
So that's where that comes from.
So not quite Pope Francis. I mean, he's not necessarily persecuting the non-believers, but like the church down the street but Pope Francis has definitely put on that green facade.
Well, no, I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about adopting green values as a religion.
Okay.
So,
okay.
Like social justice warrior type wokesters that are out there just like pounding people and canceling people, and all of that stems not from green, but from amber or from blue. That's a blue drive. So it's interesting because at first tier, we can't tell the difference. If it quacks like a duck, we think it's a duck. But at integral, at those higher stages, that second tier, we can tell the difference. We can look at it and go, yeah, that's not green. That's just blue quacking like green.
Imitating it. Yeah.
Imitating it. Exactly.
Okay. And so some of the great things about green is like a heavy focus on communication, and giving everyone sort of a fair shot.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, some of the downfalls are, cultural relativism, which can lead you down pretty
nihilism.
Yeah. Scary paths. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And also, a bad idea is just as good as a good idea. And we should probably entertain both of those thoughts. I mean, I've sat in meetings at work that, it's always nice to have a decision maker in the room who can say, yeah, that's a great idea, or no, I don't think we should do that.
Yeah.
Okay. So next, after green, we go into the second tier. And so do you think Wilbur was, do you think that this is a little bit convenient that he made second tier what he was writing about?
Well, he didn't. So second tier didn't come from Wilbur. That came from Beck. That came from Don Beck and Spiral Dynamics. So as early as Spiral Dynamics and Claire Graves and all that, they made a distinction between first and second tier, and really saw the jump from green to yellow or green to teal, if you like that better, as a big shift. Right? It's not just sort of the normal progression, but this is really a whole new paradigm. Wilbur adopted that idea, and I think it's true. I mean, actually, I think there's a pretty big shift from red to blue. So sometimes I'll say, before red, that's tier 0, and then you have tier 1, and I kind of break it up into threes rather than,
That makes sense.
But in any case, what Spiral Dynamics did was it just broke. It did see a distinction between green and yellow.
Okay, and so describe yellow to us. This is where we've gone beyond where we live now. There are a handful of people who actually are in this stage, but not very many yet. But if
more than you might think, actually, right. I think it's really gotten legs in the last decade. So like when Wilbur was first writing about this stuff back in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, it may have been like 5% of the population, but now I think it's a lot bigger than that, maybe even be closer to 10 to 15% of the population. So it has really gotten legs, I think, in the last decade. But basically this stage is, it's an individualistic stage, and a lot of integralists have problems with that. They don't like that characterization. And the reason, I think, is that in integral spheres, much like in any other stage of development, you'll still have people from lower stages that are, I wouldn't say lower stage. It's kind of a bad way to put it, because again, you have lines. And so people may be at integral on certain lines of development, but not on others. So, and when
let's make a distinction there. So you've got all quadrants, all levels, and the quadrants are the exterior and interior and the individual and collective, right?
Mm-hmm.
The levels are these things that we've been describing, and they're illustrated by concentric circles within those quadrants, generally speaking.
Yep.
So the lines, you'll often see what, I mean, it looks like an asterisk, but with different lengths
Little
of each
spokes.
line.
Yeah, little
Yeah, spokes, exactly.
Mhm.
So what are those lines? They're very rarely labeled, so I don't really know what they
they're labeled
are.
because there are too many of them.
Sure.
I mean, they're infinite, practically. I mean, you can practically say they're infinite. So any line of development, it could be technological, it could be biological, it could be social, cultural, art, artistic. It could be moral, ethical, philosophical. I mean, basically any line of discipline you can think of would be a line of development.
Conflict resolution, would that be
Sure. Yeah.
So
Business. Yeah.
so
Business
these lines,
organization.
they emanate from the center of these concentric circles, which illustrate the levels.
Mm-hmm.
They extend to whichever level the individual or culture that we're describing is at that point.
Right.
So you might be green in, say, like communication, for instance, accepting of all messages, and giving them like equal shot, or like give everybody a fair shot at their input. But you might be at a, say, like blue in terms of like conflict resolution,
Sure.
or how you feel the society should be structured, which would be sort of the making a religion out of greenness, I guess.
Right. And they say these things, there's a term called tetra arise, which kind of basically means that these things tend to pull at each other.
Okay.
So it's extremely rare, unless there's some sort of some sort of medical or issue at hand. It's very rare to see someone at, say, a really high cognitive level and a really low moral level. Like so say like someone who's morally at red and cognitively at turquoise or something. That would be really rare and would probably signal some sort of severe mental, like narcissistic disorder, or
like sociopathy or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So those levels, those lines, they tend to pull at each other. So people generally just aren't too far off, but it is extremely common, for example, to see someone who's cognitively at, say, turquoise, teal or turquoise, but is maybe morally or ethically a green, and so that slight disassociation will cause them to react differently to different things. So if I'm in an integral forum and I'm talking about panarchy, and I run into someone who is like that, like I just described, they're going to approach any sort of social organization from a green point of view.
Okay.
Even though in other lines they may be at at a much higher level, they're going to approach that sphere from a lower vantage point.
Okay, great. So, and when you say cognitively, you actually mean like the ability to parse information. Is that
thinking? Yeah, structures of thinking. Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay, let's get into integral then, which is yellow or teal.
Yeah. So, this is sort of the introductory stage for this next tier, and the real big distinction from the previous tier is the ability, again, like I was explaining earlier, to sort of change those glasses. So, and to start to create mental maps, sort of meta frameworks of these other areas of development, and really start to see the bigger picture. Like you can almost imagine, like, it's like the people who first learned to fly, and they forever and ever, all they saw the world was from the ground point of view, like from just standing on the ground. And the first guy who jumped into an airplane and was able to fly, suddenly they could see the whole landscape, right? They could see everything spread out before them. And that's kind of the difference. It's a huge difference. So, the ability to really see the world again through those different lenses and kind of really understand, where people are coming from and where issues are coming from. It's powerful because you can really see, okay, and understand why someone thinks the way they do, why things are happening a certain way. And you can really parse that out. And it also is a level where, it's much easier to see your own biases and to understand those. So
it kind of sounds like where Green wishes they were, or thinks they are even.
Yeah. Yes, that's true. Because at Green, you start to get a hint of those things, but you're still blinded by your own perspective. So you're not quite able to shed that perspective and really look at things from a higher vantage point.
There's an oft-cited statistic. I think Jonathan Haidt might have been the one who did the study on it, but basically it says that progressives, which broadly are green, have a much harder time of describing their political opponents' positions than conservatives, who broadly speaking are somewhere in the blue-orange realm. What do you think accounts for that?
I think that is not, I don't know if that's, I know what you're talking about because I've read some Jonathan Haidt. And my interpretation of that is not necessarily being level dependent, but more bias dependent. Or I would say are you more on the interior agentic side of the equation, or individualistic side of the equation, or are you more on the communal side of the equation? So it's just a matter of kind of what your values are on that spectrum, and then from that standpoint, from sort of, I think Jonathan Haidt was talking about placing value along certain moral lines as well. But being able to understand, I think, and I can't remember in which book this was, but Jonathan Haidt described, it was I want to say 6 or 7 different moral lines, and that liberals, quote unquote, tended to favor certain moral lines. Things like fairness. Fairness was a big one. I can't remember what the others were, but as I'm just kind of going off.
Right. Yeah. And actually the listener can go to yourmorals.com or .org. I don't remember which. I'll put a link, and actually take a quiz and tell where they come up on all this. It's pretty fascinating stuff. I think it's in The Righteous Mind that he talks about that.
Yes, The Righteous Mind. Thank you. And he actually differentiated not only between liberals and conservatives, but he also differentiated libertarians, because libertarians were slightly different.
Yeah, he says that he's the only one who's ever done a study like that with libertarians.
So it's really interesting. I definitely really cool to take a look at. I definitely think Jonathan Haidt is an integral thinker. In the sense that he's really looking at, he's really able to look at the sort of the map of the territory and kind of figure it out.
I wonder if he knows that, or if it's just something that came naturally to him. And actually that's why when these are the two kind of the psychologists that a couple of years ago, all of the red-pilled people were just loving to listen to, Jonathan Haidt and Jordan Peterson. And Jonathan Haidt gets, and then there's Steven Pinker and Gad Saad and them. But Haidt has a lot more cachet than Peterson socially, and I think that's probably why. I mean, Peterson is great, but he definitely comes from that kind of orange standpoint, I think. It's
Yeah,
just that they're reacting to the green from different levels.
maybe, yeah, or they just have a different way of expressing it. I give Jordan Peterson a little more credit. It's hard to tell though, a lot of times, unless you really sit down and talk to these guys and
Yeah.
sort of and really kind of dissect them.
Yeah, sure. It's like, I'd hate to be the psychiatrist on CNN diagnosing Trump with narcissistic personality disorder or whatever. So yeah, maybe we shouldn't dig too deep into that. Why don't we dig deeper into some of the jargon that comes in this integral stage? For instance, what is a holarchy and what's a holon?
Okay, so a holon is basically just a whole made up of parts, right? So you can think of it like a word is made up of letters, right? So a word would be a holon that is made up of other holons and so on down. It's like turtles all the way down, right? And so a holarchy is a hierarchy of holons.
Okay.
So, and hierarchy is a bad word for green. That's another difference between integral and green is integral is not afraid of hierarchies. As long as they aren't dominator hierarchies. So there's a distinction there.
Which will get us into panarchy, I think.
Yeah, for sure. So like I said, integral is not allergic to hierarchies as long as they're not dominator hierarchies. But a holarchy is natural, so it's of course not a dominator hierarchy. It's a natural occurring hierarchy of holons. So you can think of the example that's often given is letters to words to sentences to paragraphs to chapters to books, right? So that's a holarchy of separate holons. Each more developmentally complex than the other. And another aspect of that is to think of, that a word has much more meaning than just the collection of letters that it contains. So, jumbling a bunch of letters together doesn't necessarily mean anything, but if it's a word, then it carries much more meaning than just the combination of those letters. And in the same sense, a sentence carries way more meaning than just a heap of words, a paragraph, a chapter, a book, so on. So not only do they become bigger in a sense, but they also have way more depth. So I don't know if that's a good explanation or not. But.
No, I think it is. So yeah, basically, so a holon is something that is in itself complete, but also is a component part of something else that's in itself complete.
Exactly.
Kind of like a glue-on.
And you can think of it as going all the way up and all the way down infinitely. So,
okay. Mm-hmm. All right, cool. And I guess also one thing to point out, and I don't think we did earlier and probably should have, is that each of these levels encompasses the ones that came before it. Right. Is that right? Okay. Mm-hmm. So, and that also gets into the holon. I mean, green is a holon to itself, but also all of the previous ones were, while also being holons, are component parts of green. And
it's like
yeah. And that's why I think the integral stage, the yellow or teal, is tough for us to wrap our heads around, given that we've grown up in a green. I mean, I would place the beginning of, like, broadly speaking, the green era or whatever as sort of the World War I to Great Depression to World War II, and especially the dropping of the atomic bomb.
So it's interesting how these things come online, because often what you'll see is different lines will come on first. So green, philosophically, the sort of philosophy line, right? Mm-hmm. Green came online 150 years ago or more.
Oh, okay.
So it's been around for a while. The ideas have been around for a
Who
while.
who were some of the originators, would you say? I mean, I wouldn't consider like Kant a green thinker. I would think he would be more orange, or maybe not.
Well, I think you begin to see it in, um,
Like Stirner, maybe?
yeah, some of the like, in my view, if I were just going to take my opinion, and
Sure.
people can have different opinions on this. This is not set in stone or anything, because again, these people weren't thinking of themselves in these terms. You just kind of have to identify what are the sort of characteristics that
Mhm.
that point you in that direction.
Well, and your
So
view is your view is a hold on of what the
yeah,
actual
yeah,
like
I
fully
would,
formed thing would
yeah,
be. So
and I would say, for example, some of the early anarchists would fit
okay,
that
so like
picture.
Tucker and
Tucker,
Spooner, maybe.
Spooner, definitely, or even some of the socialist anarchists I would put in that category.
Mhm, for
Proudhon,
sure.
Bakunin, and so from a sort of political standpoint, I would go in that direction. But maybe I have a hard time with it. I and I kind of waffle back and forth. I think Marx was more orange than green,
Yeah.
but sometimes he would just about get there, but not quite. I don't think I can really place him there.
Okay.
But then, so you start out in that sort of developmental line, and then if you think, you know, I would say sort of if we're talking about our lower left social development, politics and all that kind of stuff, that didn't really start to come into green, I would say, until we started making real big gains in civil rights. And so really kind of, mid 60s, even into the 90s, is sort of the heyday of green, I would say. You start with sort of the civil rights movement, and you end with maybe gay marriage or something like that. So that spectrum of time where, we start making advances in kind of making the world a more fair, equitable place, cashing in on the promises of Orange, right? Because Orange makes all these promises, the universal rights of man and all that kind of stuff, but doesn't deliver
Right.
very well. And so Green comes in and starts cashing that in, starts really calling Orange to task and kind of making them pony up. You know what I mean?
So, do you think the shift from level to level, which obviously it's more of a gradient than a switch, but
For sure.
do you think that they're speeding up?
Yes. Oh yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
What do you think is the catalyst for that? Is it technology or just?
I think technology has a lot to do with it. Obviously, the speed of communication.
Well, and even just the fact that, I mean, when you're encompassing all of the ones below you or that came before you, maybe below isn't the best word to use.
Right.
Thinking integrally, really, but the more you have sort of stacked or progressing, the more compact everything has to be. So that also compacts the timeline a little bit.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of ways to kind of skin that cat, but I definitely think that it is speeding up, and it's speeding up really fast. So
it's really scary to a lot of people. I mean,
yeah, and it can be really confusing. So because now what we have is this global soup of just all of these V memes together, right? And that's
what's that word that you just used?
Value memes.
Value memes. Okay.
These different levels, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, in humanity's past, that's pretty rare. Typically, for all of our evolution, if you were in a red society, it would be extremely rare for you to encounter anyone who wasn't in a red society, who wasn't at that level. it would just be, everyone around you and almost every society around you is going to be at that level. You may be able to travel thousands of miles and find some tribes, or maybe you've enslaved some tribes, but there wasn't a whole lot of depth there, except for in these transition periods, maybe. But so and now within the same country, you'll have a full spectrum of people. So it's just become a lot more complex, which has made politics a lot more difficult,
right,
and more complicated. But
and it kind of necessitates authoritarianism as well, because when you have all these competing values, V-memes, I like that. Can you? Well, so when you have all these competing values, you have to have someone who's just going to make the final decision. Otherwise, they would say it's chaos or anarchy or whatever.
Sort of the democratic solution to that is just to have all of these V-memes compete with each other to find out which one's going to be able to pull all those power levers,
Do you think democracy is the god that failed, or is democracy something that we just need to hold on to for dear life?
Well, I think democracy is sort of the functionally fit. Functional fitness is another integral concept we can talk about, but it's basically the functionally fit social operating system of the current age.
Uh-huh.
It won't always be that way, and it wasn't always that way in the past, but it's sort of the best thing we have to work with at the moment. I know libertarians are going to hate me for saying that, but if I'm as anarchistic as the next hardcore libertarian, but I know that if we were just to flip a switch and all of a sudden we had a libertarian society, it wouldn't last very long, And the reason it wouldn't last very long is because there just aren't enough people who are at the developmental level to do it.
Yeah, exactly. Like there's a reason that libertarianism is not popular, and it's not because you're just not wording it right.
Right. Yeah.
Can we talk just a little bit about V-memes and memetics in general? So how I guess, yeah, why don't you just describe it? How would you define meme and V-meme?
Well, sort of the popular use of the term meme is like, that little image with text on it or something.
Yeah.
You can kind of think of it, if we want to start there, a meme is like an idea. Okay. And an idea, think of an idea as a virus, for lack of a better word.
Right.
And so ideas like a virus spread from person to person. So I have a meme, I have this idea, right? And I pass it to you, and then you pass it to someone else, and so on and so forth. And it spreads throughout society.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's kind of the functional description of a meme. So a value meme, or V-meme, is what it's called in spiral dynamics, small v, capital M-E-M-E, is basically it's basically what we call these levels, right? So the blue V-meme is sort of the idea of all of those characteristics that make up that level of development. Okay. And it could have different aesthetic sort of components to it, depending on the culture, whether it's whether that blue V meme is appearing in like Nepal, or it's in England, or wherever. It might look slightly differently, but the various components that make it blue are there. So that's kind of what a V meme is.
Okay, perfect. All right, so some of the why don't you talk about some of the benefits, and if there are any downsides to this yellow or teal integral stage?
Um, yeah, it gets harder as you talk about higher levels,
Right.
because it's like, this is sort of, we're at the very frontier of human development here. We're starting to get to like and so a lot of times it's like, what does it really look like? If we talk about an integral yellow society, and that's what I've been trying to do, is kind of flesh that out. And I conceive it as panarchy, right? But is that really, it's all kind of speculative at this point. And so, if for yellow, I think, yellow is sort of the map making stage. And what can happen at yellow is that you become obsessed with your maps and you mistake the map for the territory.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That can be the downfall of yellow. So you just, you basically, I don't even know how to describe it because I'm in it. So it's kind of, it's a little bit difficult for me to really parse it out, but I think that's kind of the gist of it, is taking care not to mistake the map for the territory and just really get obsessed with, sort of the frameworks and the jargons and all that
the
stuff.
paralysis by analysis, as we call it in like the business world. Okay, so after integral, we're getting into real uncharted territory.
Sure.
It's the turquoise stage in both spiral dynamics and in Ken Wilber's work.
Mm-hmm.
And on this chart that I'm looking at, it says holistic self. Is that what you would call it too?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, holistic self. So that again is when you start taking those maps and looking at them holistically.
Mm-hmm.
Again, we're coming back to a sort of a communal stage. Integralists have a hard time differentiating between sometimes they have a really hard time differentiating between yellow and turquoise, because I think second tier stages, the transition between second tier stages is a little less, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a little less harsh maybe than first tier stages, because at second tier you're able to see the whole map and inhabit all of these stages, and you're very aware of them. It's a little bit softer. I don't know how else to describe it, but so it's like, when have I really come into turquoise, and when am I still in yellow? It's that boundary is really fuzzy.
Sure. Well, and we don't really have the hindsight to be able to see the clear distinctions, if there are any.
Right. But the sort of the biggest thing, one of the biggest I guess differences is, and this gets a little bit complicated and technical, but that you are what they call construct aware. So, and what that means is that you are able to sort of see yourself separate from yourself. I don't know if that makes sense, but you're kind of you're able to make a subject out of your object. to look at everything, all of the things that make up you, and all the things that make up society, or whatever you're looking at, and look at those as being aware that those are just constructs and not the thing itself. Yes.
I think a lot of people who have had like near-death experiences or psychedelic uh,
Yes.
experiences tend to think
Yes.
that way.
This is the thing. So as we get into these higher levels, it can be difficult for some people because we really start getting a little like woo woo.
Yeah, yeah,
You know, and so it's and it's hard to even talk about them because vocabulary doesn't quite do it justice.
hmm
We just don't have the words. So even when I talk about it, like it's hard for me to like put words to what I'm talking about, because a lot of these stages are best accessed through what Wilber would call states. And so you can think of some of these stages as just inhabiting these states for longer and longer periods of time. And I'm talking about like deep meditative states, sort of, the people talk about, the oneness of the universe, or sort of that sort of feeling of being connected to the all of all, or whatever there's so many ways that different traditions and different spiritual traditions talk about this, but essentially that's what we're talking about is everything starts to I don't know. I have such a hard time describing it, but it's like everything just starts to kind of meld together, and all of
right.
these different
Well,
spheres of life become kind of one and the same.
it's holistic. I mean, that's the best way to describe it, I think, probably.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Do people
And so the danger though is that people who have never really experienced that level or that state, talking about it to them is very difficult because
Sure.
they're going to look at you like, what,
Yeah.
so it becomes kind of hard.
Do people regress? Like, I mean, if I've gone to a yellow stage, and some trauma happens, could I drop back down to an orange stage, or is it more that line, like one particular line or two particular lines, just
No, it's entirely possible to regress. Happens all the time, and it could be temporary. Could just be like a glitch in the matrix or whatever, or it could be more permanent, or it could just be for a really long time. Like you could have something could happen, and you could just fall down a rabbit hole, so to speak, and regress to a certain stage and kind of stay there for a little while until you work out whatever people call it shadow, but basically you work out whatever shadow you have at that stage. You have to kind of work that out before you can move forward again. So yeah,
right.
That happens all the time.
And is the shadow like Jung's concept of the shadow?
Yeah, similar. Yeah, very close.
Okay.
And the same, effectively. Yeah.
Okay.
So
Great.
it's basically, it's basically an unintegrated piece of a prior stage. So you can think of it like, we go through these stages, but we may not exactly accomplish all the work that we had to accomplish before we moved on. And so sometimes you just have to go back, and you have to fix whatever problem you left behind.
Okay. So then after holistic, we get into the third tier, which is indigo, violet, and ultraviolet.
Yeah.
And then just like the clear light.
Yeah. And all of that is super, super speculative at this point. I mean, it's almost like saying, we might as well be talking about like aliens and UFOs and whatever, So.
I think it is sort of the realm of sci-fi almost. Just so the chart that I'm looking at, it describes it as unitive self, action and non-action without attachment to outcome, which to me, that like just knowing what I know about praxeology, like how could you act or not act without attachment to outcome? That doesn't make sense to me.
Well, if you've practiced, any of the sort of Eastern religions like Buddhism, that might make more sense to you. It's
sure, like nirvana. Yeah.
Well, it's just unattachment in a sense,
Yeah.
But yeah.
Okay, cool. So so spiral dynamics is a concept and a book, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what is Ken Wilber's sort of seminal work where people should start if they want to learn more about this?
If you've never read anything from Ken Wilber and you kind of want to get, just really want to get the gist of it, I would read A Brief History of Everything by Ken Wilber.
Would you recommend digging into spiral dynamics or Wilber first?
I would. Wilber's way more accessible.
Okay.
So I'd start there. You can spiral dynamics. The book is not that. It's very academic. Mm-hmm. So if that's your thing, then by all means, dig up a copy of that and read it. It's really academic. It has a lot of information. It's a very good book. And for someone who's really, really studying this stuff, it's absolutely necessary to have that book in your library, especially as a reference. But if you're just kind of like, you just want to know what the hell we're talking about, I would start with A Brief History of Everything. It's very accessible. It's kind of in a dialogue format. So it's like a question answer format.
Oh, great. Okay. I love books like that. It reminds me of catechisms.
Yeah. And it's just really good.
Okay. So shifting gears just a little bit, I want to talk about your work. You have, and we've mentioned it a ton of times here, you have developed, or maybe not even developed is the right word. I mean, you're working on other people's work, but
yep.
You have placed panarchy within the framework of integral theory as sort of the commonsensical political framework. I've used that word twice now. Mm-hmm. That's most compatible with integral theory. So,
right.
What is panarchy?
Well, panarchy is I use the term social operating system. It's kind of a dorky term, but whatever, I like it.
Yeah, no, it's great. We're all dorks, so
it's a social operating system that can accommodate all others. Mm-hmm. So you can kind of think of it as a step. If you're a voluntarist or you're anarchist, you can think of it as a step in that direction. It's not a government like we would think of as a government. Mm-hmm. In other words, it's not like, it's more like a charter or association, okay, of communities. And those communities could represent any value mean on the spectrum. So the idea is that the panarchy allows for all of these different value memes, healthy expressions of those value memes, I should say. So in other words, we're not talking about, Conan the Barbarian and his gang running amok and, raiding villages and raping women and all that. What we're talking about is what are the healthy expressions of all of these value memes and just allowing for them to exist on their level. And so you could think of it like, you could think of it as this vast association of intentional communities where if I want to create a commune, a socialist commune, I am free to do that. And I can just sign up on the charter as, a member community in the panarchy and do my thing.
And people would also be free to sign on to more than one charter, I would assume. Is that?
To sign on to whatever charter they wish. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, more than one, it might get a little complicated, but for example, if you are a member of this socialist commune and you decide, that's just not for me anymore, then you would be free to join somewhere else or create something of your own with other like-minded people. So it's very flexible, and that's one of the characteristics of Integral, is that it's flexible. It allows space for these different ways of being, but it still has some guardrails. So it still has some, and what those guardrails are or how they manifest, I have left intentionally open. Like, I'm not. It's one of the reasons, and it's one of the criticisms I get a lot is that, I'm not out there going, this is the way we do it, right?
Right.
Because I want to leave that flexibility open so that solutions can organically arise. Like, I just want to lay out the principles and the sort of, just sort of, like the guiding principles of what this is. And then as we develop toward that, those solutions, and there may be multiple different solutions that sort of organically arise. And then through sort of experimentation, we kind of figure out, okay, this works better than that, and so on and so forth, and move forward. But the idea being that really the only thing that the primary does is it protects the individual's right to, obviously, to choose where they want to be. That's the biggest thing. And then it could also serve as a sort of clearinghouse for arbitration. Not that it would do the arbitration itself, but that it would sort of be like, you could almost think of it like the way in which different insurance companies work together to sort of solve issues. Mm. That's just one idea, but and again, I don't want to get into how it works from a technical standpoint, because all of that is sort of, in my mind, yet to be determined.
But Bryan, it's crucial that we know who would build the roads. I mean, come on.
Yes, I know everyone's worried about the roads. I'm not. I don't give a shit about the roads.
Yeah.
I mean, but yeah, I mean, it's funny, I'm a much more, I'm not a sort of, a lot of people, when I debate these topics in integral circles, yeah, it's always stuff like that. Who's going to build the roads, right? Not exactly that question, but
sure. But like, who's the authority over these different communities? Like, how are conflicts resolved? And I mean, shoot, it might be a professional community that is sort of centered around arbitration.
Exactly. I think that's a great potential solution. What I hope it is not is a sort of authoritarian government. Mm-hmm. But so I would much rather it be in the form of I don't know. You could almost think of it like an HOA. I know I hate HOAs, but I mean, you could think of it in that way where all of these member communities, all these little panarchic member communities sort of sign on to a charter, and then and that charter has certain rules, and then the other members of the panarchy kind of hold each other to task. Hey, you're not following that rule. Do we need to go to arbitration to figure this out, or are you going to fix that? That kind of thing, where it's not like, there's not like a police force basically running around mm-hmm. solving these problems. It's more self-regulated, I guess is what I'm looking for.
Well, and even if the conflicts did resort to violence sometimes, I mean, they wouldn't be nearly to the scale that
right.
the nation state paradigm is. Right.
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's it's a lot like Hoppe's covenant communities. One thing though that you make clear in your writing is that it's not necessarily geographically bound. Like,
Sure. It doesn't have to be. Yeah.
Right. I might be part of a different panarchic community than my next door neighbor.
Yeah. Yeah, it's sort of extraterritorial. And that wouldn't have worked 50 years ago. But we're at an age where we have the technical capability to make that work. I mean, it's not necessary. I mean, you and I are having this conversation. I don't even know where you are.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and you can kind of imagine that you could have a virtual community that's every bit as functional as a physical one.
Well, and especially
if that was your thing.
Especially with the advent of like the Ethereum blockchain with smart contracts and that sort of thing. I mean, building a legal framework is the future of that sort of thing is so not geographically bound that it would be a shame not to have something like that come about, because it wouldn't be using the technology to its fullest potential, in my opinion.
Right.
All right. So that's panarchy. Is there anything else about panarchy that you would like to talk about?
No, I mean, so again, I think one of the things, and I actually just wrote an article on my blog about this, published it yesterday.
Yeah, I have it open.
Is that, I think some of the trouble that people have is they look at the way the world is now, and they judge whether panarchy or anarchy or any of these speculative concepts will function in a society as it is. And a lot of times you can't really do that. And that's not really how I conceive it. You need to achieve a certain developmental level or spectrum in order to support something like panarchy. And that's what I talk about in this piece that I just published, but you can kind of think of this as like a bell curve. And or if you think of like the world or society, the developmental sort of makeup of society as a bell curve. And right now, we are, I would say, sort of the center of the apex of that bell curve. The bulk of society is sort of right in that blue-orange range. Okay. And the leading edge, the part that sort of drives society as a whole is kind of green, and a little bit at integral, a little bit of yellow there at the leading edge. We need that to shift slightly, and not much, but we do need it to shift so that the bulk of people are at least orange. The reason we need that is because orange is the level where people start using their words rather than their fists. That's not a joke. I mean, that's the level where people. That's the level where people. I mean, they're still willing to fight, but that's the level where people start to use rationality, their mind, their words, language. They start to fight with those tools rather than sticks and stones and guns. And so we need the bulk of humanity to at least be there. And then, of course, the leading edge to be at integral. Well,
What do you think it takes to do that? Is it just the passage of time, or can people be persuaded to go from one to the other?
Well, yeah, it's all about persuasion and education, and like that, basically spreading that V-meme virus that I talked about earlier from person to person, and making sure it catches hold, and and all of that. And that's happening faster and faster, like we also talked about. So I don't think it's terribly far off. I'm pretty optimistic. I think it'll probably happen in our lifetime, but it's hard to say. I mean, it's, anything could happen. We could regress. We could have some catastrophe and the world could regress back to, some prior stage, and we'd have to clean ourselves up and, go through the whole process again. So who knows? But from where we are right now, if I'm being optimistic, I think it's definitely achievable in our lifetime.
There's a novel I'm reading right now. It's called The Dim Age, which the reason that I even started reading this novel was because of Vin Armani talking about the Dim Age on my podcast. Mm-hmm. They're completely unrelated, but the novel takes place in a very distant future, like 200 years into the future. So maybe not very distant. But anyway, in the future, humanity has regressed to, I would say, a blue stage, because in the year 2031, I think, the Earth was hit by a meteor, and the whole book is about trying to rediscover like what these computer chips, how to use them, and all of this stuff, all this technology that they don't know how to, like all their car, they have cars but they run on methane, because when the meteor hit, the tides shifted so much that it flooded all of the oil rich areas of the earth or something like that. Anyway, this book shows a sort of a what could happen to cause a regression. But like I said earlier, and I think this really rings true for me anyway, that the progression from one phase to another, it necessitates some sort of crisis that kind of forces it to happen.
Oftentimes it does. And it's very possible that we could be living through such a crisis right now.
Right.
People talk about a lot of people talk about The Fourth Turning, which I think that's a great book. I don't know if you've ever read that, but we very well could be in a stage where, a sort of crisis spurs that shift, and I realized that back in 2012, which is why I started writing about panarchy, is because I was afraid that was about to happen, and happen very violently, and I was hoping that by sort of writing about this stuff and getting that stuff out there, that I could maybe convince people not to do it so violently.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But you can only control what you can control. And, if humanity needs to beat itself up in order to advance, then that's just what needs to happen.
What do you make of the Great Reset? Have you heard much about it?
Yeah. I think it's basically pathological integral. That's the way I see that.
Yeah.
All of these stages have their healthy manifestation and their pathological manifestation. So, I think that the pathological manifestation of integral in society would be something like a dystopia, like a soft tyranny where, all of us have our UBI and we're all just kind of, functionally enslaved to the powers that be, and dependent on them completely. And so, that's possible. That is a possible future.
Which kind of brings it to your novel that you wrote. Is that kind of what that takes place in? Yeah, so you wrote this book. It's called Alternate. Why don't you just kind of talk a little bit about that before we wrap up?
Sure. Yeah. So I wrote that about it back in 2012. So it was about the same time that I was writing about panarchy, and I was basically imagining, what if I failed? So what would society look like if, we were in this sort of soft integral tyranny? And how would that manifest? And so it's set in that sort of dystopia. I won't give too much away about the book, but basically it's set in the future. I chose the year 2084 for a reason. Kind of an homage to 1984 and Orwell. But set in the year 2084 after a really disastrous war. And it's just sort of about a guy who is part of this society, and through some circumstances, he's kind of thrust into a revolution that he at first didn't want any part of, but then became very important to him. And that revolution is called Alternate. So that's the title of the book. But yeah, it has a lot of sort of these integral principles in it.
Perfect. And that's available on Kindle Unlimited, which Amazon, for all its faults, man, that Kindle Unlimited has upped my reading in the last year or so. I wanted to get back into reading books rather than just short form articles, and that's been a huge help. So I'm going to throw
a hard copy too.
It's got a paperback, and also if you don't want to do Kindle Unlimited, you can just buy the ebook as well, which I'm going to be doing. So, Bryan, is there anything else that you'd want to hit on before we part ways?
No, thank you for the interview, and I hope people find this stuff interesting and look into it more. And if you've never even heard of integral, then definitely try Ken Wilber's book, A Brief History of Everything, and it's a great place to start.
Cool. So one final question: if you had to give someone advice for how to prosper in this coming age, I guess. Mm-hmm. What would you say to the individual who wants to be successful?
Well, first I would just advise that you really think about what does success mean to you, and just try to improve yourself. Always work on improving yourself, and what I mean by improving yourself is not just learning new skills, but also practicing sort of all quadrants, if you will.
Yeah.
Inside and out. Yes. So yeah, that's what I would suggest.
Cool. So I'll make sure to put a link to your website, which is a great blog. There's tons of good information on integral theory. So even if you don't want to dig deep into the books, there's a trove of information there. Your Twitter, you're at Broderland, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I'll make sure to link to that. Is there anything else you'd like for me to link to?
I'm pretty active on the integral community on Facebook as well.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a bunch of integral groups. Integral Global is probably the easiest, most accessible. If you do Facebook, which a lot of people are moving away from, but
whether by choice or not.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, you can find me there too.
And then you've got a new podcast as well, right?
Yes, Integrate This Podcast. We have about 10 episodes so far. And I do that with another guy named Marshall Eon. We co-host that, and we haven't posted in a while, but we are definitely making new episodes. So,
okay. Cool. Well, I really appreciate your time today. Audience, I appreciate you sticking around for this full 2-hour long podcast. It's the very longest one I've done, but this information is so interesting and valuable that I thought having a longer form episode was probably worth it. So thanks again, Bryan, and I hope to talk soon.
All right.
All right. Thanks again to Bryan for joining me today, and thank you for listening. If you were interested in integral theory, stay tuned. I have other interviews planned on the topic, but also be sure to grab a copy of Ken Wilber's book, either the hard copy, ebook, or audiobook. All of those links are in the show notes. And if this topic interests you, or if you have any questions, be sure to shoot them my way either on Twitter at JamesLJ, via email by replying to the email notification you get from Substack, or get in contact with me on MeWe. I will warn you that MeWe's chat function is not quite up to par just yet, so I do miss a lot of messages, so Twitter and email are probably best. I'm also going to put a link to Dan Stringer, who wrote the new intro music, so that you can get in contact with him if you would like to add music to your project, or just are looking for a new artist to discover. I think he's pretty great and deserves to be heard, and I'm sure he would appreciate your business as well. And I think that does it. So I will see you on the next episode of Blackbird. Thanks again for joining me. You know what to do as far as ratings, reviews, and thumbs up and all that goes, so I just won't pester you about it anymore today. And until next time, live free.